For the next session, we will focus on the social enterprise. What is its power? How does it link people to technology? And how can big organizations remain human in this technology-driven and COVID-19 impacted world? Well, according to the latest Deloitte Human Capital Trends report, there are 3 characteristics that companies should embrace in order to be a social enterprise. And these are purpose, potential, and perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Global Leader Organization Transformation at Deloitte, Yves van Durme.
Thank you. Social enterprise. Social enterprise at work. This is our 3rd year of looking at the social enterprise. It is also 10th anniversary for us. So 10th anniversary in terms of looking at human capital trends. Just a bit of credential, about 10,000 respondents globally, over 500 in Belgium, which gives it an interesting perspective. The social enterprise, for those of you that would not have read the trends in previous years and not looked at it this year, is looking at organizations that are combining profits and revenue with elements like environment and the broader community stakeholders that are playing a role. And as you can see in the subline, paradox as a path forward, that's indeed what we've been discovering. So the paradox is a situation, person, or things that combines contradictory features, and that is what I will talk you through. And I think that's one of the challenges ahead of us, is indeed how to remain distinctively human in a technology-driven world. Technology-driven world, and that's something which is quite interesting, or a challenge to be able to cope these two. A bit of perspective in terms of 10th anniversary, which I indicated, there is quite a lot of things have happened in the last 10 years. And we've been looking at it from 3 sort of perspectives over the decade, and you will see sort of 2 lines. A yellow line, which is looking at what it has meant for us as humans, how we've been navigating through a number of elements, like discovering the network of teams. Like we rediscover that teams is where things are happening. But we also discovered a challenge on productivity. We have been investing a lot of technology without sort of capturing the productivity gain we were hoping, and that's requiring a new social contract. And a green line, which is fascinating for those of you that have more of a technology focus, we discovered the cloud, jobs in the cloud which didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. We've been looking at redesigning work with automation and different sorts of technology. An explosion of data has been part of what we have been facing. So many fascinating elements which we have been riding, and of course you've noticed that these lines aren't always merging nicely, so there is something to be tackled there. To be tackled there in that human technology element, because this is sort of part of the paradoxes, is how to tackle both a new social contract, network of teams, a social enterprise, as I defined a bit earlier, which are all fascinating things when you like human behavior and you have the best intention, but also exponential change in technologies. That explosion of data, things you've been hearing probably in different versions, which is there is a lack of data, there's a lack of insights. What do you do with these insights? But also fascinating technologies like drones. It's amazing to hear stories of chemical producers where engineers have retrained themselves to be drone fleet managers as part of predictive maintenance. Great elements to be looking at, but how can these 2 be combined? And how much are there indeed a paradox or an opposition to be looked at? And these 3 paradoxes that Anne briefly highlighted in terms of looking at the 3 Ps as we refer to them initially, are looking at belonging versus individuality. Belonging versus individuality, which is looking security versus reinvention, and to give them all the way, boldness versus uncertainty. On the left side, you see human traits related to our craving for belonging as humans, our need for security, but also our ability to trigger boldness. At the same time, technology has created more individual world. All of us have an option to sort of configure how we look at Facebook, how we do shopping. It is about us. It is about our patience and impatience to get served within whatever we consider is an acceptable time frame. It's also about reinvention. There is new business models, sometimes a bit scary, but sometimes fascinating how new business have emerged, mostly platform-driven businesses, but it's also triggering a lot of uncertainty. Just to notice some of these elements about bias, it's amazing how technology, or scary actually, how technology is triggering even more biases. And not more biases because humans didn't have biases. Of course we had biases. We would be silly not to admit that. But how that is driving sort of even more biases because they are now in algorithms, and basically they are exacerbated even when we use them at scale and at pace and with a lot of speed. So looking at these paradoxes, how do we solve them? Will they be solved? What's the path forward? And will we have the courage, the creativity to drive it forward? Looking at all three a bit more separately, humans versus technology, that's one you've picked up, belonging versus individuality, which is triggering sort of, what about individuals and our individuality not being a source of division, us being different and looking at the differences? How can it be a source of bringing us together and using our unique complementary abilities in the pursuit of shared goals? That is what we are looking to combine. And there a trade-off to make, and how can we tackle that at an organizational level? And this is only exacerbated by COVID-19 and security types of elements, but also more creativity. In driving purpose, one of the 3 Ps I'll mention, purpose is an organization that doesn't just talk about it, but that's also looking at embedding it in everything we do. And that's where it's fascinating. I work a lot for healthcare companies, is they have a great purpose. I mean, improving quality of life of people, there is no easier purpose almost, but how do you connect that to what we do on an everyday basis is still a challenge to a large extent. Looking at purpose from a tomorrow perspective, because that's where it becomes interesting. Tomorrow, what happens tomorrow with purpose is for me the most fascinating. That organization that connected to at level of the team, the individual, but also the work itself. And I think it will be also time to reinvent, to re-architect how we connect work to make it a source of driving purpose connected with that rather than using different logics. More about that a bit later. I said 3 paradoxes. This is only the first. Looking at the second paradox, which is security. There is a human need for security. Well, what instead of being perceived as secure as a threat, how can reinvention become something that helps us to find security in the midst of ongoing change? And the pace of change, unfortunately, has not decelerated. With COVID-19, also the measures and reinvention is required, and business models are under pressure. Some businesses are struggling a lot. How do we look at it to capture that in the potential? How do we tap into the potential of the best of humans, their thinking capabilities, their creativity? And how can we do that in a world of machines, full of machines? How can we tap into that joint potential together? And how do we do that in a tomorrow where organizations establish forward-looking workforce strategies, forward-looking, which is so difficult today because most of our organizations are discussing how to respond to the crisis situations from a human sort of health perspective, and how do we enable us to contribute from a forward perspective, looking at what comes next. How do we look at our different sources of workforce? How do we make sure that these different sort of workforce, we have respond to that looks further there today, which is what we are fortunately forced to do and what many HR leaders are doing. We are looking already in our next human capital trends where there will be a first new report end of December, and I've seen some preliminary results, and it is a big challenge. How can you combine that strong focus on what's happening today and preparing for the future, which is things you can't just do in sequence. You need to do it together, how difficult that is for us in the HR profession. For those attentive listeners amongst you and viewers, there's 3 Ps, boldness versus uncertainty. Boldness is still, for now, a very human characteristic. You can call it silly for some of you, but boldness is these guts, that courage to do new things and put that forward. How do you combine it in an uncertainty environment where indeed you don't know what's happening with technology? There's many risks related to technology. How do we create these moments to take the benefit of all these opportunities with decisive action? Not just decisions, move to action. And that again, sort of from a perspective, which is a 3rd P, looking at how we are not optimizing for today, but creating the value for tomorrow. How do we learn to look around the corner while we are fixing a plane that is in full flight and that has heavy winds, which we are all facing in many economies and many sectors in what is happening today. And it's looking at tomorrow, where it's viewing towards the future, not forgetting about today, but increasing our confidence to be bold and take the action, not waiting and following, because this is something where there are no proven paths. Nobody predicted that pandemic and with magnitude, which is only making difficult on top of all the things which we were already doing anyway. So this brings it all together in 3 Ps. 3 Ps which are basically the DNA of the social enterprise at work. And it's not an easy task, but I'm sure it's a challenge that all of you are looking to face and that you already are working on to a large extent. Purpose, potential, perspective. And how do we resequence that DNA that we have in a social enterprise at work today and for tomorrow as well? Looking at it a bit more in detail, purpose. Purpose is covering this year 3 trends: belonging, designing work for well-being, and post-generational workforce. And I'll spend a few minutes about each just to give you some perspective. Belonging is actually interesting to look at, at least for me, from a perspective that we initially were looking at diversity and inclusion, and we felt there is something next for diversity and inclusion as well, something which is not easy to reconcile in a certain extent, which is how do we combine comfort, connection, and contribution, and don't make them separate things. How can you bring your authentic self at work and contribute to actually create a contribution? And that combination of a contribution, sense of belonging, and bringing your authentic self to work, that's the winning combination that we've been seeing, and with a very, very high extent. What we've been seeing is that 79% of the survey respondents said that in the next 12 to 18 months, fostering a bigger sense of belonging is important to very important for their organization. And 93% agreed that that drives organizational performance. That's one of the highest numbers we've seen in the last 10 years of our research, looking at the level of agreement in terms of bringing that element. Yet only 13% say they are very ready to address this trend, which is actually quite shocking. And looking at what's underlying, we look at elements of culture and leadership, which is very important to be able to tackle all of this. And culture is something that is very comprehensive and a big C culture, where in most organizations, culture is something that's dealt with as a problem. Like, as a problem, you have to fix your culture. But that's the same thing like saying you have to fix a personality if you look at an individual level. It's not about fixing, it's about building on it. And it's building on it where at an organizational level, it's about being valued. 46% saw being valued as a key driver. The team feeling of being able to contribute is the second most important element, and also being treated fairly and being able to show your authentic self was also a driver of performance in this element. And one of the interesting cases that we are exploring in the trends themselves is looking at NASA. NASA has that great quote like President Kennedy walking into a room, looking at a janitor cleaning the room and asking what he was doing. And the answer was, "I'm helping to bring a man on the moon." And we went back and look at how they're connecting that sense of purpose, a sense of belonging in their organization on a day-to-day basis, without the same bold statements that existed at that time of Kennedy, but also in a reality where today their workforce is only 1/3 which is on balance sheet and 2/3 is alternative workforce, which makes it even more interesting to see the practice they've put in place since. Looking at a second element, just sort of raises the question, which is how do you, in a way that impacts for both employee and organization. That combination is also a paradox in itself, but that's the key question, the key driver of success that we see. Second trend is about well-being. And there's a big aha for us that came out in well-being when we were looking at the results. But before that, looking at well-being, living and performing at your best, which is something that resonates a lot in these moments where we haven't worked from home as much as we have now. And we are going in all directions, looking at should we define rules about working from home 2 or 3? Is it a right? Is it something we force? What about these technology organizations that announce that they will allow work from home from 100% basis for a significant period of time, even for an indefinite period of time? How do we enable performing and living at your best, which is something that is largely human as well from an individual perspective, but we also have that sense of being part of a community. And 80% of organizations, of the respondents, said that it is important for the success in the next 12 to 18 months, but only 12% are ready to address the issue. For the ones that like numbers, have been sharp at paying attention to the previous trend, the gap is even slightly bigger with the previous one. It's also looking at, it's an organizational responsibility well-being. And I think that's interesting because well-being has, in many organizations, been treated as something largely separate, despite all the efforts of well-being looking into that. But an organizational responsibility is, how do we as employers, how do we cope with that? How do we structure for that well-being as something that we're responsible for, not something that we need to cure when there is a problem? How do we anticipate? How do we go beyond physical elements? How do we include the mental elements? How do we make that part of, is that part of the role of a leader? And I think this is where we see that 50%, yet fewer than 50% are seeing impact from well-being that extend beyond the workforce experience. So we see this as a very workforce experience, almost HR perspective, which is a bit surprising for me because it's not well integrated into work. And work is not an HR responsibility. It is helped to be designed by HR, of course, but how do we bring it in a sense that this is part of how we design work, at the heart of what we do? How do we bring it at the heart of what we do? Jobs used to be designed as we define processes, we define handover moments, enabling technologies for that. We look at responsibilities, we package that, and that's your job description. And I would tend to scare people, or try at least, I'm sure you can't be scared, but try to scare people by saying, well, if your job description is accurate, and if it's not looking at outcomes but at activities, there's a big opportunity to do a lot of automation improvements with that, which I'm not looking to favor, but I think jobs should be about outcomes, and it also means that it should be structured and designed differently than it is today. So, but how do you do that? Design the work for well-being as part of the work itself. And I think that requires to rethink all of our grading, structuring, job description elements that we've been supporting as the worst of evils. Not the worst of evils, of course, but as the best practice that was available, but that was not driving the element of comfort and the element of contribution we were looking to have. Third trend within the first paradox, the post-generational workforce. And this was the hypothesis of looking at these different generations and how are we structuring, especially in large organizations where you don't know everybody, how do we segment workforce programs? What are the attributes or criteria we're using? And generations have been a very sort of popular element to a large extent, but looking at moving away from that, because millennials is a simplistic characteristic which is in parts very different from different parts of the world. Looking at it, what it means in a part of Asia, and you can subdivide Asia to the US, to Europe, but also for Africa, for example, there is different major events that are influencing the quality of work, the quality of life, that are shaping how we look into it. But how do we deal that? What are other attributes? How do we look at some elements which are, for example, inclusion? How can we look at inclusion as one of these elements which we can bring into part to actually structure programs even more than the generations are actually doing, as one example? I'll share a bit more in another trend, some perspectives. Looking at 70% of organizations were saying this was an important trend in terms of being able to lead multi-generational workforces. So despite what being the sort of structuring elements, and 52% are considering workforce to be structured according generations. And I just said that's probably too simplistic as a criteria. We need to have more segmentation criteria. For those of you that would be marketeers or have a marketing background, segmenting a population in 5 categories or 4, depending on the generation you have at work, that's something which doesn't bring the fine-tuned elements to be able to play into the persona. How do we get closer to the personality where individual treatment is maybe too fine-tuned? What is the in-between level where we look at common personality characteristics, which also are relevant to the size of your organization, to be structured that? But more importantly, there is a need to also be able to manage across these multi-generations, because this was one of the lowest points in the survey. 6% say leaders are equipped to lead a multi-generational workforce. And we have 40% expecting other characteristics to drive segmentation in the future. So how do we move away from these traditional segmentation, and how do we look at having more focuses on different experiences which are driving the segmentation, and finding the right balance between the size of your organization, the level of segmentation at the individual level, or something in between, which is looking at attributes, which is the same thing consumers are using in marketing for consumers. Apologies, looking at how we segment to sort of look at the triggers, but also looking at what is influencing the overall experience and the link to the actual desired behavior that we are putting forward. That were the first three. The next three looking at potential. Potential looking at three sub-trends: super teams, knowledge management, and beyond reskilling. The first one about super teams. Super team is all about putting AI in the group for transformative business results. There is that power of imagination, which is looking at how can we do two things? How can we enrich, augment teams? Last year we're looking at super jobs. How can we augment, multiply the impact a person can have in his or her job by augmenting what he or she is able to bring as an output in terms of using technology? And this is where there is using technology. How does it apply to the actual notion of teams? How can we accelerate, augment the power of teams for transformative business results? And at the same time, we are looking at the potential also to transform and reinvent careers, because there is so many different new roles popping up. And this is looking at putting AI in the group. 70% of organizations are currently exploring or using AI, or one form of AI which is put in place. And the good news is only 12% of respondents are using AI to replace workers. So I think I love that sort of element. A lot of it is not intended to replace workers. So what is it about? What are we using it for? And this is where only 17% of respondents said that they are making significant investments to reskill to support their AI strategy. So we use AI, 70% are looking at AI, and only 70% are making significant investments to reskill our employees to actually support the AI strategy. So a bit of a paradox. 58% of focusing on AI are looking at improving consistency and quality. This is not really AI, by the way, but this is how we phrase the questions. This was really looking at different use of technology, and this is looking at a form as assistance, cognitive assistance, which is of course interesting form that we can sort of look at improving the quality of the work we do, the quality of our workers, and improving their jobs. But how do we actually do that? Not to sort of look at the quote-unquote easier elements, which are repeatable, data quality, where humans have a tendency for errors because of repetition, where most of us struggle after a certain period of concentration and lack of concentration, better put. How do we also look at other forms? And you'll see, if you want to read a bit more in the report, or if you want to join me in the round table afterwards for some questions, this is about costs, and this is our thinking model as well as humans. Do we use AI in individual jobs and in teams for costs or for value and meaning? And we see that only 16% are using AI to improve insights. And I think insights is exactly one of the points where you could use it to augment the value and the meaning of what teams are doing and how they can focus on the right things. It's amazing how many teams in organizations I know of, in our organization sometimes at clients as well, that you see that are focusing on actually sort of finding out what to do, and where there is a waste, sometimes a bit of creative process, but mostly a waste in terms of figuring out what to do with the insights, how to bring it there, and how can we use more imagination. I think this is one of the fundamentally human skills, is how can we use the imagination not only to do cost saving, which of course we need to do for our organizations, but also to create more value and meaning as we are moving forward. Looking at truly optimize the value of AI, I think that's the key question for you to take away for this trend. Looking at knowledge management, this is the first time in 10 years that we have that trend as such on our trends research, and it was a very timely moment, because it's very much about creating a context for a connected world. Of course, there is more information, more data. How do we sort of curate all of that? But looking at different elements, knowledge management used to be in most organizations that largely boring element, almost like how do you sort of capture structure, try to chase things which you are always just late for, which is important to share knowledge. But how do you look at creating knowledge, which is that sense of context that you are creating in today's world within the organization or with other connections even outside of that to maximize human potential, which is again looking at that potential perspective. Looking at 75% of surveyed organizations said it was creating and preserving knowledge across evolving workforces is important. So creating and preserving knowledge. So if in your organization it's only about preserving knowledge, you are missing part of the opportunity, which could go as far as creation of IP, intellectual property, and how knowledge management can be part of that strategy. That's where it becomes fascinating power. Yet 55% only define it as knowledge management, as documenting and disseminating knowledge, which is a bit late, which in a quality safety environment is of course critical to do, but we are missing part of the potential that we're looking at. And 67% of organizations have yet to incorporate AI in their knowledge management strategies. And that in a day where, I mean, my kids are 15, 14 years old. I mean, if Google doesn't have it or YouTube doesn't have it, it doesn't exist. I think we need to involve elements as well. What is strongly driving knowledge management, especially as well in Europe, is 52% see a risk of knowledge loss, which we have an older population in Europe that could partially explain that as well. But only 43% see the knowledge creation purpose, the potential of knowledge creation as the intent of our knowledge management approaches. Looking at beyond reskilling. Beyond reskilling is fascinating in terms of what do you reskill for? All organizations seem to be reskilling almost all the time. And this is looking at what do we invest for? These futures are uncertain. We can't really define the skills very precisely. How do we predict? What are we reskilling, upskilling, and others elements? That's why we call it beyond reskilling, because it almost sounds or feels like a bit of an endless cycle of being just too late, despite the great evolution we've seen in learning technologies, in learning progress, in ability to measure. That skill chase is something that is still very difficult to find. And I think there are some underlying characteristics, and resilience is the key element that we've been flagging. Like, this is a no regret move. How can you improve resilience at an organizational level, of course, but also at the most individual level? And resilience is very mental these days, because not having the same level of contact is something that us humans are not geared for. We need hugs and kisses. Whatever you think, this is part of the contact we need, and this is also the healthy elements that it brings, but this is unfortunately not the time to do that. So how do we sort of look at resilience in the broadest sense, depending on the types of jobs, but how do we stimulate resilience in our organizations? 53% of organizations said that between half and all of their workforce will need to be change their skills and capabilities in the next 3 years. This is massive in terms of needs, and this is something that is keep on evolving and in terms of pace. Yet only 70% said that they could anticipate the skills needed to a great extent. So there is an imbalance almost structurally, like we don't really know exactly what these skills need to be. Then we need to have the people ready to be using these skills. We didn't prepare for that. So this is a big pressure as well. And this is even more accentuated by that 16% that you see on screen, which is looking at the likeliness of investing significantly. So if I would go back for a second, looking at the 53% of organizations that are looking to have between half and the whole organization that needs to change skills and capability next 3 years, and then looking at that 16% which I just touched, which is actually the likeliness to invest significantly in that area over the coming period, I think this is scaring me. So how do we align the efforts on reskilling with the challenge ahead of us? And this is where part of the answer is not the only answer, but part of the answer is looking at better predicting the skills, better analyzing the skills, making them more specific. Technology could help us, because technology is learning faster than we do in a number of areas. So how can we embrace technology? At the same time, we could think about making work more interesting for humans. Let's look at these enduring human skills, and resilience is something that us humans need. And if you look at what I commented in our previous trend about on super teams about imagination, how can we rethink how we are working effectively in teams would be a very, very interesting perspective to have. 3 Ps, 1 to go, and then I have a special trend to announce as well. Looking at perspective. Perspective is looking at 3 trends: compensation, governing workforce strategies, and my personal favorite, ethics and future of work. And I'll explain why it's my personal favorite when we get to that as well. Looking at the compensation conundrum, as a non-native English, that was a fascinating word to discover. In my mind, it's a riddle. It's that thing which you are continuously trying to solve, which seems to escape you or is at risk of escaping you, but maybe you're better at riddles and solving conundrum than I would be. But let's see. So looking at how to break that endless cycle of compensation and benefit change, it almost feels like any organization, there is a continuous change, and sometimes it's tweaking, sometimes a more fundamental change, which is in part led by, we do look at data, we look at benchmarks. Of course, we need to do that and keeping at improving at that, which I think is also needs to be enriched by what are human principles? What's the human behavior? What are the cultural elements that we're looking to stimulate to try to get out of that riddle? Looking at a reality which is, in some organizations, the salary and wages accounts for up to 70% of the organization's total cost. That is a massive part of the cost structure depending on the activity. Some industries it's way less, of course. But if you look at 56%, and this is across the different industries, having redesigned their compensation strategy in the past 3 years, and another 64 are planning to redesign it yet again. So that rat race, almost like how do we find the right solution? We keep on searching and improving and tweaking, which makes it very difficult. I think these human principles are something to pause on, because these human principles are fascinating from a perspective like, how do we embed purpose? Can we embed purpose in our compensation strategies and practices? How do we look at that transparency? Transparency is something that is a reality. I mean, CEOs are very transparent in most parts of the world in terms of very visible what they do. How do we create that transparency in organizations as well? We still have a bit of scare of that, but could we also use ethics as part of the human principles? What is the level of variable pay that would make sense in that, if any? Is there not something in the social enterprise where it's the whole enterprise that benefits of the results that we're having for stakeholders, profit, but also for the environment, and how can we factor that into our organization? Is the essential element of collaboration, isn't that a bit more of a cooperation structure, where there is mutual benefits to be read? And maybe I'm going to philosophically, I've been reading Utopia again recently, which might bring part, but how do we look at solving that compensation design and redesign perspective? And maybe we should get back to some harder principles, which are not strictly comp and ben principles, but how do we look at these human principles to actually try to get out of that race, that riddle, that conundrum that we seem to be trapped in. The governing workforce strategies, I think it's time for new questions that drive better results. I think this is where the inclusion metrics, which we go beyond diversity. Diversity is typically looking backwards. How do we look at having people from different inclusion ambitions that are in a position of influence? That's where diversity comes into practice, not just the statistics, because it's not the title, it's not the level, it's actually the position, the influence. How do you combine that with elements of network analysis? Because network analysis gives you a better view on influence than hierarchy in itself. And we've done some fascinating work recently looking at mapping sort of position of influence with leadership levels, and it's not exactly what leaders would have expected that comes out of it in most organizations. But how do we look at what are the questions to ask for? Those of you that are interested to go a bit more in depth, and I could encourage it, there's 12 specific questions that we spend a bit of time on. And there is questions about what is your projected brand value? What is the risk appetite of your organization? But what is the change agility? What is the likeliness of change in your organization? And I think that's a role that HR should be having amongst the many roles that you can choose and probably need to pick up battles. But one of the roles is there's so many changes happening and we are back to sort of even more change. I think there is almost something perverse about COVID-19 where many CEOs and leaders have felt that changes could happen very fast in an organization, almost overnight. I'm hearing these stories where, oh, it's amazing how we've moved to Teams and Zoom or whatever technology you've moved to almost within a week, even overnight, are the hero stories I've heard. But is it really changing fundamentally the way of working? And how much change can we still cope for? And imagine you would be in a position to indicate, well, these changes we can't handle on top of everything which is being looked at. So looking at the results, 97% of respondents report needing additional information on their workforce. I mean, this is not everybody, but I would say close to it, looking at we need additional data. Only 53% not only are saying that the leaders themselves are expressing interest in workforce-related information, and they want direct access. They want to be able to look into it. But yet only 11% are producing workforce insights in real time, 11%. So the pressure is increasing. We need more information. Our leaders outside of HR are asking for more information. It's only 53%, but this is a growing trend. And only 11% are producing some form of insights in real time. So how do we manage? And actually even more scary, 43% are producing it ad hoc or not at all. So which I think is actually a bit of a scary piece. And if I connect that with reskilling is something that I shared in our Beyond Reskilling trend, where there is a lot of reskilling happening and there's a need for more. Remember the 53% of the workforce, half to full workforce needs to be reskilled in the next 3 years, changing capabilities fundamentally. In this trend, we looked at sort of how much are we able to track the progress. And only 14% of our respondents were able to say that they are tracking the reskilling progress. And only 8% of our respondents were saying they were ready to tackle the governing workforce strategies. How do we anticipate changes? Let's think about one of the professions which is largely under pressure, nurses, the nursing profession. How do we help changing these roles and predict for that and asking the right questions? The next trend in this category about perspective is looking at the ethics in the future of work. I said my favorite because I think this is a very interesting and very scary one. Very interesting in terms of 85% believe that we should be looking at these ethical challenges, and we should move away from a could we to how should we, because it's happening. We cannot say again we didn't know, we didn't understand the algorithms. I said 85% of respondents said it's important, but only 27% have clear policies and leaders in place to manage them. A statistic that's not on the slide, but which is the scary part for me, only 12% feel it gets board attention. This is such a high risk of reputation for discrimination, bias in how you serve your clients and your customers, which I think is a critical element to look at. What is giving me hope is 66% see it as a top priority in the next 3 years. So I think this is important, especially at the intersection between human and technology. This is where it becomes difficult, part of our paradox we've been covering all the time. How do we look at creating more impact in that perspective? And these are the trends which are related to the 3 Ps. I said there's an extra one, a memo to HR. There will be a session dedicated to that tomorrow, so I will not go too deep on that. My colleagues, Evelyn and Lisbeth, will spend a full session on that. But I think this is important to look at just highlights, just as a bit of a teaser. 65% of respondents looked at HR as making progress in the past decade, which is quite a good result. But there is a momentum to expand the focus and extend the influence, which is very important, especially in these times where there's so much pressure on day-to-day basis just to keep us safe and healthy as employees. How can we expand the focus to covering the whole workplace, workforce on behalf of the whole enterprise? How do we tackle elements I mentioned earlier? How do we embed well-being in work design? How do we look at workplace where it's not about the rules, it's about creating a sense of belonging and respecting individuality? How do we look at all the sources of workforce? Many organizations have a big variety already of different sources of workforce, different contracts, different collaboration. How do we get beyond the excuse of saying our culture and the rest? How do we create that the whole ecosystem with one joint culture, look at embracing the future, while us having a reality that there is a crisis, a health crisis, this is a time for CHROs. The previous crisis was a time for CFOs. This is a time for CHROs to step up. What is actually also elements that will be looked at a bit more tomorrow is looking at 55% of respondents believe that HR will substantially change. And yet 26% believe are not confident to the ability that HR is to make the change required. And if you add an additional 37% which only is somewhat confident, that's a majority where the confidence level is not very high. And I think there is a paradox popping up if I look at our next survey. The paradox is we have to tackle the crisis and we have to keep our people safe, both physically and mentally. And we have to prepare for the new business model evolutions at the same time. There is choices to be made, but how do we actually make sure that we're not falling back in the trap that HR has in many organizations is a specialty of policies. This is a moment to also look more and more at outcomes and fundamentally changing. And how can we make that shift to have a more exponential impact in the future of work? Just to recap, looking at our 3 Ps, purpose, potential, perspective, looping back to where Anne started us, looking at purpose, potential, perspective, the DNA, looking at that constant paradox between technology-related elements and human elements. And this is something that we are looking to tackle as an organization. A paradox is difficult. It's something which embraces our strengths. It's also about strengthening our human capabilities, our enduring human capabilities. And for reminder, purpose is a paradox which is a result of tackling individuality and belonging and looking at getting the best of both and making some trade-offs. Potential is our need for humans for security and the capability of technology to reinvent things like careers, and how do we do that in a future-focused approach is what perspective is bringing us in terms of tackling uncertainty that all that technology is bringing. How is it working together? How is it wrapped up? How is it actually even sort of chaotic in terms of all these technologies, and moving from one technology to the other is what we are dealing with in an environment where knowledge creation, to tap into one of the previous ones, is something which is fascinating, the notion of knowledge creation. Looking at it from what I think is actually super interesting is looking at it from that social enterprise a bit more in detail, which is looking at the one axis. We are looking at the enterprise. The enterprise is typically something which is about looking at the resources and how we make our most productive use of resources allocation, and there's a very internal focus. It has been moving to the ecosystem, at least in parts of our organization, if not fully, where the ecosystem is also something which taps into the likes of an open source access to information. The best skills are sometimes not part of your organization and don't want to be part of your organization because they love what they do and they are up for your biggest challenges, be it in a hackathon type of format or in a crowdsourcing, you only pay for the best idea. This is sort of opening up many perspectives as well as sort of a specialty driven world where we are looking to create that ecosystem of connections. And then also looking at it from a, what are we focusing on? And this is where one of the challenges we uncovered in previous trends, which keeps on being very sharp, is how do we structure organization? In the introduction was mentioned organizational design is some of these elements of our conference as well, is functional. Functional is the reality of creating sort of control, specialty, expertise, but it's also cutting an elephant in pieces, as we sometimes say, which in these days there is more and more need for how to create value across functions. How do we solve the most complex problems? How do we help to combine elements of finance, of legal, of technology, and of HR to support, enable our businesses rather than to be separate disciplines which are functionally doing the best we can and the best to the table, but competing even for attention? How do we move to a more symphonic environment where it's the network of teams across functional quote-unquote silos which is the dominant operating model? And I think that sort of element of a traditional organization, where are we looking to get better at the functional organization, better at our internal enterprise, this is something that has been largely under pressure. And this is the whole notion of resequencing the social enterprise DNA. And it's On the visual, you might have noticed that there is some parts which are a bit darker, a bit more grim, and that we have that circle, that bubble almost, to use a very popular term these days, that bubble where we have tried to sort of visualize how there can be a harmony and an augmentation of us humans learning to work with technology for the best of our sakes in terms of our future careers, our evolution, and embracing it moving forward in a symphonic environment, which is where a C-suite and the entire organization is looking at tackling the most challenging elements with a broader perspective, not only of shareholders, which are important, but broader stakeholders, and looking to also not only make profit and revenue and managing cost, which we have a responsibility for in organizations to do so, but do so at the same time in looking at the environment and the broader society at large. This brings us to sort of a close, at least for me, in terms of the social enterprise at work. This is our third year of looking at the social enterprise, and we were a bit wondering about sort of the COVID-19 impact on the social enterprise, and I think we've been at least early signs that the response to the pandemic has put HR in a way more important seat than before in most organizations, which is enable us in a better spot, enable us to have even more credibility to be able to tackle, not an easy job to tackle, but to tackle the challenge of these elements of transforming three things at the same time: the workforce, and the workplace, for the pursuit of a more social enterprise.
Thank you very much. I have one more question for you, if I may. So, do you believe that employees fully understand the values of their company?
It's a trick question. Not everybody, of course. I think this is also where, for most organizations, the values are aspirational. One of my dear clients, and I can't quote him, but he would recognize himself, was the bigger the size of the posters, of the flags of your values in an organization, that is to hide that you're not strong at them. And I think this is where some of the values are the values you have and you can be very proud of. And I'm sure employees would know these ones, because that's the one they experience, they live on a day-to-day basis. And then you have the values which top leadership defines as aspirational, which is the things that you want to have more of. And if you want to have more of, it sometimes takes a bit of time to have them embedded in the organization. And this is where it's typical management speech to raise ambitions and to have them ahead of reality. So depending on, are they the real values which exist today or are they aspirational, my answer would be very different to you, Anne, going from yes to almost no.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for this final keynote presentation of today, Yves van Durme.